Hey, friends, and welcome to our short stories, Good Stories podcast, short stories. So these are, the intention is for these to be shorter than our major episodes. That sounds so grand. Shorter
We are
than
pretentious. Yes.
well, you are.
Uh,
Prospero. That is very pretentious.
you have no idea. Can I go into the background of the name? Because I've been thinking about it.
About Prospero?
Yeah. So in Latin, a lot of the words end in ere. Prospera is probably to prosper or to succeed. And so prospero is first person singular indicative, which says, I succeed. So if you want to talk pretentious, just his name.
Prospero. That's from The Tempest, if you haven't listened to that one. See, I just learned something new, too. Anyway, this one, Steven and I have always talked about stuff, and they're enjoyable. I learn things all the time. He knows more than I do. But I think I might be better at asking questions than you sometimes. So that's kind of what we want to do with these, are just little short versions of things you might know something about. So I wanted to ask my, not an expert, but very well-read, enthusiast brother, what are the Crusades? I told our friend David Bates that you could just wing it. So go ahead, wing it.
I will try to keep this to under an hour.
These are shorts.
The Crusades are one of my favorite periods in history. It is a time of noble deeds and vile deeds. It's a time of villainy and a time of heroism. And above all, it is a time of cultures and faith and groups coming together. Sometimes peacefully, sometimes violently. It's a fascinating time. The Crusades is born out of the Islamic conquests. So in the 7th century, when Islam began to spread, it began to conquer. At that time, the world was broken into the Western Christian world, ruled largely by the Pope in Rome. Ruled is the wrong word, but influenced by the Pope in Rome. And then you had the Eastern Byzantine Empire that still just called themselves Romans because they were the heirs of the Roman kingdom, ruled out of Constantinople. Well, that Eastern Empire had been mighty for a long time, but it was starting to crack. It was starting to fade, and it was starting to fall. And this is where the Arabs came in. So the Muslim invasions came in and began cutting out and taking out huge swaths of the Eastern Christian Empire. That includes things like Egypt. It includes things like the Holy Land. And most importantly for the Crusader story, it includes Jerusalem. The Eastern Empire and the Western world of Christianity were not on the best of terms. But the Eastern Empire was in trouble. And so at the end of the 11th century, the king of Byzantium sent a letter requesting aid from the West. He was hoping for military help, people to come as basically mercenaries in order to help him reconquer and defend against these Islamic forces that were taking out so much of his land. Well, Pope Urban II took this to a whole nother level. At the Council of Clermont, he stood up and he said, brothers, this is the will of God for us to go recapture the Holy Land from the Muslims. So this was all done and started with the idea of taking back Jerusalem that had been conquered shortly thereafter. And this is what launched the First Crusade. There is no way the First Crusade should have worked. It was insane. There were all these different armies that were marching their way from the west to the east. The Eastern king got far more than he bargained for. He was not looking for foreign armies to come marching through his lands, especially those that didn't serve him, but they came. Entire Western armies were decimated before they even made it to Jerusalem. Those that did go across, there was infighting, there was squabbling between themselves, there was squabbling with the Eastern Kingdom, but this ragtag bunch eventually made it, and they conquered Nicaea, they took Antioch, and the First Crusade conquered Jerusalem. And so what you then have is the Frankish or Latin kingdom of Jerusalem set up in the Holy Land. This was an outing that never should have succeeded, but somehow it did. Now they're in the Holy Land, and now they try and make a kingdom. And so for the next couple hundred years, you have these foreigners across the water trying to set up this kingdom and defend it from all the armies around them. It doesn't last long. So the kingdom eventually falls, and you get this sequence of further crusades. And what I love about it are these different interactions, because you have the interactions of the East and the West. You have the interactions of the Christians and the Muslims. You have the interactions of the Mongols who come into this. You have the interactions of subgroups of Islam, including the Shia Muslims. You have the assassins. The very word assassin comes from this time frame. And you have several hundred years here of basically cultural mingling, mixing, combat, cooperation, and it is incredible what can be learned from this time period.
How many were there? Crusades.
Depends how you count, but a lot. So there's usually referenced... I lose interest after the Third Crusade. So the first three Crusades were kind of the Great Crusades. The First Crusade was the one that took Jerusalem. The Second Crusade, 1097, okay. I want to say.
Ballpark is fine.
Yeah, I may be off a little bit on that. But and then within, I think, 50 years of that was the Crusade of Kings, the Second Crusade. Jerusalem fell back to the Muslims under Saladin following that. And then you have the Third Crusade, which is the Crusade of Richard the Lionheart. After that, the Crusades kind of morph. It stops being just about conquering Jerusalem and defending the pilgrim routes, and it starts to become, you can set a crusade against anybody who disagrees with you. And so some of these got really dark really fast. So the Franks conquered Constantinople. The Western Christians would start launching crusades against heretics, right? People that were not Orthodox. And some of these get pretty bleak. And so crusading kind of lingered for a while after that. I believe when the British General George Allenby rode through Jerusalem in the Second or First World War, he said, the Crusades have finished, because he was back in Jerusalem. So again, how you think of the Crusades, when they stopped, a lot of debate on that. It's kind of like, when did the Roman Empire fall? Well, it depends how you define the fall. So
is a Crusader and a Templar the same thing?
No. A Templar was a form of Crusader. So crusade simply refers to a journey of the cross. So crux is the cross. And so when these pilgrims, which is how they saw themselves, went on this crusading journey, they became pilgrims. Ceremonially, that involved putting a cross on your clothing, and you were usually given a staff and a script, a bag. And this became your Crusader garb. This meant you were a pilgrim on the way. The thing about pilgrims is that they don't tend to be very good at defending themselves. And so there were a lot of pilgrims traveling these very dangerous lanes trying to get to the Holy Land. There was a young knight named Hugh de Payenne who decided, this isn't okay. We need to come up with a group to protect these pilgrims on their journey to the Holy Land. And so this knight, this young noble, submitted to the Pope this concept of, hey, I want to start a holy order. So remember, holy orders are bound by a threefold vow: poverty, chastity, and obedience. None of those things are things you would associate with a knight, right? Knights, by definition, were wealthy. If you own a horse, you are wealthy, and knights would have to have several. Chastity? Nope. That was not a thing that was usually attributed. And in fact, many of the stories of the Crusades are involved around camp followers and rape and pillage. So chastity was not necessarily a thing associated with knights in the Middle Ages.
But this became things in the Middle Ages for this reason, right?
In part, yes. And then obedience, right? Knights are out to make a name for themselves, whereas in a holy order, you give up all your decision-making to the authority above you. And so what the Pope granted was this new holy order that became the Knights Templar. So these were knights that were also monks. So these were literally holy warriors that were bound to this threefold vow of poverty, chastity, and obedience. The Templars themselves got their name because when they were commissioned, they were actually stationed on the Temple Mount, and so they got their name from from the temple, and they became the Templars. These are probably the most famous of the military orders of the Crusades. Second on the list were the Knights Hospitallers. So the Hospital of St. John was a hospital. That's where the pilgrims could come through. And they also formed their own military order in competition and in brotherhood, both with the Knights Templar. And so these were really the shock troops of the Holy Land. There was no real standing army, and those who came on crusade were often pretty ragtag. But the Templars and the Hospitallers, they provided a backbone. They provided a very strong military force that lasted for quite some time.
Well, I'll show my ignorance. Who were the Saracens?
Saracens is a name given to one of the cultural subsets of the Islamic group. Usually, I think it refers to the Turkish nations, where the Saracens. And in the West, when they talked about the Saracens, I think they were usually referring to the Turks. Although, remember, kind of like today, when we talk about other cultures, often we're not terribly subtle and often mistake names for things. So a name given from the West isn't necessarily reflective of what the actual people group was. But broadly speaking, the Saracens were the Turkish Muslims.
Okay, and my last question is, where is the Templar treasure?
It was stolen by a French king.
Was it?
Yeah.
Which one?
So Philip, I can't remember which number.
Oh,
but,
Philip.
Yeah, so he was the one that brought down the Templars. So he accused them of all sorts of evil and wickedness. The Pope was in his pocket at the time, and he did it because the Templars were rich and he wanted their money. And so this is where the idea of Friday the 13th being an unlucky day, this all happened on a Friday the 13th, several centuries after they were formed, and this was really the end of the Templar order. The money was stolen by the King of France.
You know, Friday the 13th gets a bad rap. I like Friday the 13th. There's something special about it, but agree to disagree. So you kind of talked about what ended them. I mean, it was just, it sounds like a defraying, right? So
Yeah.
the intention got skewed and is no longer worthy, so less people involved. Is that fair?
Yeah, I mean, you can get up energy to go and do this big thing, but then no one wants to actually take over and grow and make a community there. So all these knights would come from the West, but then they had to get home because somebody is out to take their castles, right? They have to maintain law and order. So Richard the Lionheart is a great example. So he loved crusading. He would have spent his entire life crusading, but he's actually remembered, frankly, as a fairly poor king of England because he was never there. He was, I mean, I think he was quoted as saying that he would sell London if he could find a buyer in order to finance his wars overseas. And so these royals, these nobles had to be back in their lands. Well, as soon as these armies left, the Islamic forces around them would just swarm in again. And so it was always a losing battle, really, from the start.
All right, so that's like the shortest version ever of the Crusades. Good job, by the way. But how do you know that? Like, where did you read these things?
When I was in college, I didn't know anything about the Crusades. I was studying science mostly, and I knew I liked history, but I had studied almost none of it. And I had this vague feeling that as a son of the West, I needed to be embarrassed about the Crusades, that there was something vaguely dirty about them, that I should be embarrassed by them. But I realized I didn't actually know anything about them, so then I started reading. And the more I read, this was right after I graduated from undergrad, I just fell in love with the area. The whole time period is fascinating. There are such incredible personalities and accomplishments, and I read. So I started by reading a lot of sort of general histories of the Crusades. But once you start doing that, you realize that there's only so many primary sources, especially that have been translated. And so then I started hunting for those. And so you have things like letters from the Crusaders. You have things like History of Deeds Done Beyond the Sea by the Archbishop William of Tyre, who writes a history of the Crusades in the early days. Several other of these sources that are now on my bookshelf, and you just get into them. Most people who are interested in the Crusader period tend to find certain areas that they like more than others. So like I say, I tend to focus more on the first three, and especially the First Crusade. Other people's also get really interested in the later ones or in other aspects of it. The other thing that I loved about it was I got to spend a semester in Cairo when I was in college, and that really piqued my curiosity and interest in Islam and Islamic history and in the cultures of that region too. And so in this crusading movement, you get to study all that. And then you get the Mongols. I mean, the fact that the Mongols come in is just... Oh, they are terrifying and awesome, and it was just a fascinating thing to study. So I just read.
Okay, super fight. Knight Templar versus, I don't know, Jason Bourne. Who'd win?
Same weapons or different weapons?
See, that's where it gets tough. Same weapons, just to make it consistent.
I would say the Templar. I think they had greater discipline and they would fight in numbers.
More a lifelong...
They were lifelong warriors. Now, they were terrible spies, but
Sure.
Which Jason Bourne, owns that. But I think they were definitely better warriors. And remember, the symbol of the Knights Templar that is most commonly seen in the iconography of the time is two knights riding on one horse. It emphasizes the poorness of them, but it also emphasizes the camaraderie and the teamwork. So if you take on one Templar, you're taking them on all the Templars. And so I would go with the Templars.
Oh, very good. How about Knight Templar versus Chuck Norris with a BB gun?
Oh, Chuck Norris rules everything. There's no taking down Chuck Norris.
I knew it. Okay, good job. I know that was this sprung on you, but I told somebody you could do it. I knew you could do it. So.
Well, again, it's a fascinating portion of history. I have much to learn. Like all these things we talk about, I'm an enthusiast, not an expert, but it's a time and part of the world that I think we've kind of forgotten it. Most people, again, have that sort of vague sense that they should be embarrassed by it, but they don't really know what it was about. And it's interesting to dig into it to realize that it's both better and worse than you imagine.
Well, you're so good at keeping it all contextualized. So for me, I know some of that, but I couldn't just pull it out, and putting it in its proper place in the chronology of history is really helpful to me, just in reading things in general. And even when people throw back to like historical fiction and things, to know something about what was happening at the time, I think is of great value. So it's of great value to me. Thank you.
Well, I'm glad you enjoyed it. Well, if you'd like to hear us talk about a real story sometime, please join us for our Mainline Good Stories podcast.